everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by BAFTA-nominated filmmaker Doug Aubrey to talk about Legacy of an Invisible Bullet, which I'm going to leave to Doug to explain because there's so much to talk about. So first of all, hello Doug, how are you doing?
Hi Alistair, it's great to be here, and hello Scotland again.
So before we get stuck into the details, how can you give us an overview of Legacy of an Invisible Bullet?
Well, I guess to call Legacy of an Invisible Bullet a film is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually 170 short films that together have a runtime of 10.5 hours. A question I would ask is, like, who really wants to watch a 10.5 hour film about some white guy dealing with cancer and his universe falling apart and his archive and his life and things like that? And to be honest, I've been quite surprised who has picked up on it. But there's a lot more complexity to it. No, it involves a subconscious avatar played by a woman, a very famous Danish actress called Charlotte Monk, who's basically my subconscious. But as well as being a voice, she also replaces me from time to time in the films. So that there's a play on gender going on as well. But anyway, yeah, so to call it a film is a bit of a misnomer. The 170 films are divided up into 16 chapters.
Yeah.
And in Glasgow at the GFT, we'll be showing them in 5 cinema programs over the course of 5 consecutive days. And the whole point of it is, it's not so much a linear thing. You can drop in and out, come into it and leave it, come back to it. Which actually brings us to the other element of the project, which is actually a graphic novel stylized app, which is currently available on Apple Store free.
Right.
But the purpose of that was to give the entire archive of films, the ownership of it, to an audience, so that they can actually dip into it and explore it, either linearly or thematically, depending on how they feel, or combine the big screen cinema experience with the app experience. Not content with that, and also to meet a contractual obligation to the funders, we had to make an abridged feature cut, which will be showing at the GFT on the night of the 13th, which I see more as a kind of, like, well, you could call it the longest trailer on the planet, along with one of the longest films possibly, but it stands alone because it's more of a thematic exploration of the entire project, to act as a primer for an audience to then maybe want to go deeper into the project.
I see that you've kind of described it as an existential surf movie, which I was fascinated by that description.
Yeah, I guess because, you know, of all things, I think a lot of good surfers will probably hate it because I'm a pretty lousy surfer. You know, I can stand up and fall off, and it's been a part of my life for a long time. But an element to it is this notion of, I came to dealing with cancer and treatment and various, I refer to it as going on a surf trip, an extended surf trip. So that was quite a useful way of actually encapsulating that whole experience. The other side of it is actually a surf across time and territory, the whole project. You know, it goes right the way back to the 80s, punk era, when I was a young skinhead punk making films, Super 8 films, right through my experiences in conflict zones, all the work I ever made in Glasgow, filmmaking here in Copenhagen, but also it's this sequences in Jamaica and Cuba and Middle East, and you know, so it basically does cross time and territory. So I guess that's the existential element to it. You know, one of the chapters is called Kierkegaard's Existential Telescope. But I won't say too much about that. Hopefully, people will explore that in the app or come along and see it at the GFT.
So that's what I was going to say. How can it's a lot? You say it's split into chapters. The screenings are kind of split into sections, aren't they? I think the first one's chapter 1 to 4, and so on, right the way through. So people can come and see the whole lot if they want to.
Yeah, they have done. I mean, surprisingly, we've done it as part of the development and the completion of the project. We did some test screenings. And I thank the CCA Creative Lab for that, because they let us run it for a week when we were still working on it. And I was surprised. I mean, among other people, Tamdeen Byrne came and sat and watched the whole 10.5 hours. But people do come and they stay. You know, I mean, the normal gallery experience of an installation, say, is you kind of walk in, look at it, and then walk out again quite often.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, people came and they sat and they watched, and then they came back and they sat and they watched again. In Copenhagen, we've shown it in different locations, and again, surprisingly, people have become. The best description I had it's like somebody called it a binge-worthy experience, you know, like existential Netflix or whatever, you know.
I mean, that's a great description, because I was kind of thinking about short film in general and how, with the way that we watch things and consume things and how that's changing, whether the short film, you know, has actually got a really strong future. And I hadn't thought about the binge nature of it as well, where people can, if they want to, they can go through the whole thing in one shot.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, I would say that the big screen experience is very different to, say, like the experience on a mobile, you know.
Yeah.
Because it is designed for a big screen, and the sound score by Travis Reed. I mean, sorry, the sound design by Travis Reed, with music by Jim Sutherland and a legendary jazz musician here called P.S. Hawke. It's, you know, it all sort of works on a big screen. It's designed, you know, for the cinema. You know?
Yeah.
So that's important. So the experience of it is very different. But when you can combine the two, people have been combining the two. Or coming back to films, or you know, or jumping in later and coming back, you know, exploring the narrative themselves or inventing the narrative.
Well, I presume that's where the app that you were describing, and the kind of, I was going to ask you about the graphic novel nature. I didn't realize it was an online kind of graphic novel. People, if they can only see one or two, they can get the whole thing there. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it is structured by in the form of a graphic novel, and the illustrations for that and the work for that has been done by he's actually a legendary Danish, Turkish Armenian graphic novelist and artist called Halfdan Pisket, who's pretty well known here and well known in the European graphic novel scene. So he's kind of like illustrated aspects of my subconscious, and you know, he's basically illustrated the whole story, but it kind of crosses over between the films and the interface. So the interface is all based on his images and his imagery. It was quite a long process to put the graphic novel, you know, the app together. And that came out of several things. One was the COVID era, you know, and I think a lot of us actually thought, are we actually going to get to go into a cinema again? So it's about trying to create a platform for people to actually, you know, get the project out to an audience. But since then, it's taken on a life of its own, in a sense. And I would say with the graphic novel, with the app, there's a group of people who are starting to call themselves the 170 Club.
Right.
And they're the people who've watched all 170 films. So it seems to be a growing number of people around the planet who are part of the 170 Club, which is nice.
That's fantastic. If people want to find out about when it's on, what's the best thing for them to do? Is it to go to the GFT site, or?
If they go to the GFT program, they've been pretty good. I should really big up the GFT here. I think it's been quite brave of them to give somebody 6 nights or six screenings in a row of a project, which is pretty left field. But the other aspect to it is the first 5 will be showing in their Cinema 3, which was designed for these kind of projects.
Yeah.
And I think as filmmakers, we need spaces like that. Because if they disappear, then what are we left with? No, they're multiplexes, things like that.
No, absolutely. And it seems, I almost think that, because maybe of the economics of filmmaking, that short film is the place where experimentation is still happening. You know, it's difficult to do it in the longer form. So absolutely, it's the place where people often start off, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, short films, I mean, I would say actually, my first thought was, I used to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with short films. Part of the reason for that is I used to see a lot of them were just like directors trying to get an actor to walk in and out of a room without falling over, you know, as a basis to get their feature off the ground, kind of thing. But as a form in their own right, I think they are actually, they can be very powerful, especially on the web and various other things where maybe people's attention span drifts and what have you. But having said that, now some people might say, I mean, some of them are just one-take films, you know, of 170. Others are quite complicated pieces of involving archive and dual narration and various other things. So it has been quite an experimental project in that respect.
And how did you even begin to put it together, all these hours of footage? Did you think, I'll do it chronologically? Did you do it thematically? How did you what was the starting point then?
I guess the starting point was my cancer diagnosis in 2013. Because up to that point, I'd mostly been working on longer form features and documentaries. In the past, I'd done some news work for Channel 4 and various other things, which was always quite exciting and quite adrenaline. You know, it gave you an adrenaline buzz from it because it was fast turnaround, very immediate. But I guess I started it around at about the time of my diagnosis, and it was like, I mean, I've spent my whole career pointing a camera at the world. So the whole idea of turning the camera around on myself was in itself quite a big move for me, you know. And,
Yeah.
And then I just started recording what was happening. Both, I mean, some of the films are very visceral because I do record some of the more gory details of dealing with cancer and the aftermath and the treatment, various other things that happened to me in the course of it. The other aspect of it was I originally started my career in the 80s as a video artist.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all about making shorter form pieces. And one of the projects I made was a project called A Filmmaker Strip Bare. And it's basically what it says it is. It's about exposing myself, you know, myself naked on camera,
right,
being ordered around by an authoritarian voice off camera. Now, part of the reason for doing that was, well, you're going to expect other people to strip themselves bare in front of your camera. You have to know what that feels like. So I did take it to an extreme. And that film is actually included within one of the earlier chapters, called A Filmmaker Strip Bare, as it says. But you're right, you know, the short form, it's important. No.
yeah.
And it is a way for people to do things. But, you know, I really wish it would go beyond the, like I said before, the actor walking through the door without falling over kind of film. You know, there are some people who make fantastic short films. I think we've got mutual friend Peter Mackey-Burns, who's a great short film. I actually prefer his shorts. I like his short films.
Yeah.
And our company worked with him on Milk, and the producer on Legacy, Marie, worked with me on this project. So yeah, I think it has, you know, they have a resonance because they're good at catching the moment and the immediacy of things. And the other aspect of it, I think we sometimes forget that one of the best things we can do with a camera is write with a camera.
Yeah.
You know, which is not a new thing. It goes back to the French auteurs, you know, Jean-Luc Godard and people like that. You know, to talk about camera stylo, camera as a pen. So I've very much used the camera as a pen in this project in a lot of ways. That's also because I can't write.
But how was it going back? I mean, you spoke about the early stuff there and your work in and around the kind of punk scene. How was it going back? You know, we've all got perhaps pictures that we go and look at every now and again, and it takes us back to these things. But to actually have film footage of what you've done, was it only recently that you revisited for this project, or have you always been going back and kind of looking at that stuff?
I guess it was there right from the beginning, really, like the example I told you there about the filmmaker strip there. So it was also the other aspect to it is a lot of the films I made in the Balkans and the Middle East. And there's a lot of stuff that never actually got included in films that were eventually shown on Channel 4 or was screened in cinema, you know. And there was a view like, well, actually, by revisiting the archive, there was stuff that actually resonated with my present moment. Now, for instance, there's a film called A Balkan Window, which actually starts off as a view out of a window in Copenhagen, but goes back to a place called Birchko in Republic of Srpska, which is a war zone, basically.
Yeah.
So it was the whole idea of exploring, things that maybe I thought were discarded, but had have a resonance. And also became very conscious. It's like when you film it as a filmmaker, you sometimes film stuff, especially documentary. You think, well, I don't know where this is going to fit, but everything connects. It might not connect immediately in terms of what you're doing, but the resonance of the connection maybe comes later, and that's one of the things I became very conscious of. And the other side of it was, it was just great to go into an archive and open it up, in a way that, rather than just being a curatorial project, it gave it a timelessness in a sense, by becoming part of something else.
And can you see yourself changing as a filmmaker throughout the project, or does it depend on a kind of project by project basis, or if you know what I mean?
I guess the early stuff, it's back to the punk era, skinhead era, and things. Angry young filmmaker with a Super 8 camera, art school boy who became an art school boy sort of thing. But I would say that the anger's always been there, as a filmmaker. But I think a lot of people have said when they follow the whole series, the first 4 chapters, there is quite a lot of anger in them, quite a lot of like, what the hell, what the fuck's happening kind of thing. But by the end of it, they feel, oh, you've really mellowed out. No, I don't know whether that was an effect of the cancer treatment or the effect of making 170 short films. But
maybe just the effects of growing older. Maybe that.
Well, I think there is that element to it as well, and I think that's actually an important theme, the whole notion of the aging process.
Yeah.
And what we do leave behind in the end, because that's all that really matters, I guess, in a sense. Our legacies, which aren't necessarily material, which aren't materialistic, they're what we say, what we've done, our images, our words, the universes that we create, that are different to our, the current circumstances which we're living in, which aren't great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would go back to your kind of early days, filming in and around punk. I mean, it was kind of notorious as an angry scene anyway, was it? I mean, that was part of the thing. It wasn't even so much, for me, looking back, that much about the music. It was really about the ideas and the energy that came from it. Is that what attracted you?
Yeah, it was that notion of fuck the world and do it yourself kind of thing. That do it yourself culture that, you'd listen to a band and then you'd find a record label that you'd never heard of, put out this record. And it kind of like fed across, I think, into a lot of writing, and it fed across into art, visual art, and also into filmmaking. The whole idea that you could use a Super 8 camera or an early video camera to actually take control of a medium that you always thought was just for people from Oxford and Cambridge and whatever, was really important. It was about empowerment, and also about that particular. It was about exploring the roots of what we call multiculturalism, because most people forget that things changed. The punk era was part of it. The whole reggae music and the Afro-Caribbean crossovers, and at the same point we had the National Front, various other people trying to divide people. But the punk thing, although it was angry, it was about unity.
Yeah.
No?
And so really you picking up a camera was your version of here's a chord, here's another chord, go and start a band, which was the kind of famous cry that came out from punk. You said, well, I can get a camera and there's no reason why I can't just go and do it.
Yeah, I think that was it. I mean, I wish I could have sung like Billy Bragg or Joe Strummer, but that was not going to happen. So yeah, it was my way of doing things. It was like picking up a camera and doing it, and then going to art school on the basis of, I didn't have huge academic qualifications and things like that for university. But back in the 70s, you could still get into the art school on a basis that, one, I could draw, and secondly, I had these bunch of Super 8 films, and so they let me into this foundation course. And then I discovered, video. The video thing was starting to happen in the 80s, the video art thing. So the porta packs and the color video stuff, and that opened up a whole new universe as well. But the punk ethos was still there, I thought, in a lot of the work that was going on.
And you mentioned that you worked in disaster zones across the world. And I always think, does viewing such disaster through a lens, does that give you a distance, or is that impossible? Is it still immediate?
It does give you a distance, but it also can have a negative effect on what you're seeing, because you tend to armor yourself, help to create an armor against what's happening around and about you, what you're looking at, and what you're seeing. So there is that distance. No, it's only afterwards quite often, even when you're looking at material, because you stop looking at what's happening and start looking at it as, I hate the term, content. As footage, that you're going to cut or you're going to edit and things like that. And you're always looking for that moment, as photographers do. I think that's the big difference, between somebody in a situation like that with a stills camera and a film camera. You have to spend a lot longer with a film camera to get moving camera to get what you want. Photographers just, they're just there, catch a moment, and they can move on, kind of thing. But the main thing is just hanging back. And that's one thing that always fascinated me. It was like, most conflicts just go on long after the so-called peace agreements, which aren't really peace agreements, because let's face it, nobody wins wars. I think that's one thing that's become evident to us, ever since probably the Second World War. Nobody wins wars. So the whole notion that a war has an end point, well, no, it lives with people for decades. As you discover, as I discover when I go back to the Balkans, 25, 30 years on, people still live with that conflict as if it was yesterday. The Middle East, it's even crazier. People still talk about conflicts 1,000 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. So the whole idea that conflict in some way leaves us is not happening. And I guess the other thing is, even back, my work in Glasgow, it was a different kind of conflict zone. We work with a lot of street gangs, we work with the police, and there's a different kind of tension within our culture, and makes you realize we're actually not far away from what we see on Al Jazeera and CNN and the other places. We're not that far away from it, really. It's just that mindset.
And is the Glasgow footage included in the film as well?
There's a whole section of material from Glasgow which I call Walking with Ghosts, and I think that Glasgow is very much a walking city. That's what I like. Copenhagen's very much a cycling city because it's flat and boring. Cycling's a good way to get around, but Glasgow's a walking town. To really get to know the place, you've got to walk around from the East End, South Side to. But for me, Glasgow's also mapped up by all the places that I filmed over a decade and a half, pretty much from 9/11 through to 2012, 2013. So there is a lot of that material is included, but I found when I was recovering from cancer and I was radioactive, I couldn't go too close to people, but I could go on walks around the city. So I started walking around places that I'd previously filmed in, Sight Hill, the East End, Wasteland to the East End, South Side, and obviously connecting that material that I was filming then with material from the past. So it's a series called Walking with Ghosts because half the people in the material aren't with us anymore. So there is quite a big, I'd say, a significant part of the film is set in Glasgow. The project's set in Glasgow.
And you mentioned almost turning the camera on yourself for the section after your cancer diagnosis. And how did that change? I mean, it must be such a kind of fundamental thing for a filmmaker to do, although it's very simple, is to turn, the camera around. How did you approach that change?
I guess it's some of the early films are all shot in front of mirrors. It's that notion of mirroring,
Right.
which I guess is where the Avatar character or Charlotte Monk's role came into it. Was by turning the camera around, you're not only looking at yourself physically, you're also going into this inland empire. This thing that exists within you, your subconscious. So I wanted to try and reflect more of that. So Charlotte helped a lot with that, in realizing that, playing the part of this Avatar character. So she exists as a voice, but also as an image. And occasionally she replaces me, or we very rarely meet. We meet occasionally on a surf trip, and also Halfdan Piskett's images, opening up a subconscious realm that maybe is not filmable. And then music also plays a big part in that. T.S. Hawke's sound score, which was very important to it, because it ranges from kind of like punky avant jazz kind of stuff through to basically just guttural voice, very, almost gestalt kind of voice stuff, So it's just turning the camera around, it wasn't just mirroring; it was going much deeper.
Sure.
And sorry, Carol. No, and I learned a lot. And I learned a lot about myself. And I learned a lot about how how we deal with fear. That was, I think, it was a big subject, big theme within the project. Is the notion of fear. Fear. I know that you've explored that in some of your work.
Yeah.
But it was that whole idea of fear, and how I've seen fear in some of the places I've filmed, seen it in people's faces, but confronting and dealing with your own fear as a man.
That's what I was thinking about. Is it's one thing seeing that in other people's faces, but to kind of see it on yourself. Going back to the existentialism, that's a real kind of question there, isn't it? That happens.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing you find with, cancer, especially something like a life-threatening illness, is that what it does, it strips away all that armor that you think you have. And as a filmmaker, a younger filmmaker, I was pretty mad for it. I liked the idea of going out to these places, and it was a buzz to do these things. But part of that was creating a armor around yourself, and the camera helped with that. Filming helped do that. But once something happens to you, that I'm loath to use the term, a war starts within you, or a conflict starts within you, then it does take all that away. It makes you look at yourself as, not just flesh and bone, but it's like, well, what does it mean to be male now? What is? So, I guess a big element of it is an exploration of masculinity, and the vulnerability, and our vulnerability,
Yeah. And I mean, I guess when there was a reason that you kind of decided to film that way, but then once you do, it's almost like letting the genie out the bottle, isn't it? Then there's all these other things that you think, well, this is going on as well, and they're all linked. It's not just about one thing or one diagnosis.
Yeah.
Everything else comes in. And was really, so I can see it's making sense to me as we speak, why you would then want to go back to the beginning and put this series of films together. Was that kind of how it unfolded?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what I've tried to do with the project is to give it a timelessness, although, some of the material is obviously from certain dates, and reflect, like, 9/11, for instance, or the Balkan, is to try and give it, the whole project, a sense of the moment, that it has a timelessness to it. It's not like, I'm watching a film that was made between 2013 and 2023, although it was pretty much put together during that period. I hope that we created with it a sense of kind of timelessness to it, so you can visit it and think, well, actually, it's not out of date.
And you've spoken about the soundtrack and the music. How does that change the films for you? Does it just give it a kind of different aspect, or does it kind of fundamentally change them when you collaborate with other people in that way?
It's, for me, it's about, I mean, music can introduce an emotional layer to things that perhaps the written word or spoken word can't. So I've used music very much in that, though the music's been used very much to add to an emotional layer of things. The films aren't all dialogue based, you know, some of them are just visual pieces with a musical underscore. So as well as an overscore, there is an underscore and a drone occasionally that comes through. I should mention Jim Sutherland here as well, because he took some of Torsten T.S. Hawke's tracks and did some remixes, which are pretty phenomenal, you know, in terms of, because they really kind of like bring out a sense of the tension that exists within a scene, for instance, you know, or the emotional resonance of something, or the visceral nature of some of the material. So music was an important part to it, but the other side to it, you know, I wasn't doing it like a pop video, short pop video, bang bang editing to, you know, but it did change the tempo of things, and it draws people into the images, which is fascinating, you know, to see sometimes. You know, if you just have the music and the image working, which is an important aspect of filmmaking, it is what filmmaking is really about: music and sound and image, not necessarily words, spoken words. So yeah.
And is it in the edit that the real kind of creativity happens? You know, you were talking about filming and then having decisions to make, particularly with regard to disaster zones. You know, there's maybe even moral decisions to make about, you know, what you actually put in the final piece.
Yeah.
So is it in the edit that you know, you're really kind of tested as a filmmaker?
I think so, very much that was the case. I mean, the original edits of the films that I did were like 20 hours. The whole project was 20 hours long. And at that point, I kind of realized, well, I need to get people to come in and start looking at this. So Charlotte Monk, who was the avatar, she became involved in that process as well. But there's quite a well-known Danish author called Mette Hugh, who became very much my script doctor in a sense. But she went through the material with me and started looking at it on the basis of, as a writer, but also as a woman, feminist, looking at it from a perspective that maybe I didn't have. So there was this interesting dialogue with her that was going on through the whole edit process. And it wasn't necessarily a conventional filmmaking process either. It wasn't production, then edit. The filmmaking was going on as the editing was happening as well. So it was a rolling process on pretty much a daily basis for 10 years, which again is something nice. You know, it's like, I think we sometimes forget as artists and filmmakers, you know, it's something we can do every day. And that's what I liked about the project. It was like, it was actually filmmaking as something that I did every day.
And did you have, from the beginning, filmmakers or documentary makers who were an inspiration to you, or was it just a case of, I'm going to find my own way of doing this?
There have been lots of examples of filmmakers who've made lots of short films. Oh God, names. I'm a big fan of Jean-Luc Godard, especially as more, you know, the guy died last year, and his most recent film is probably one of the most experimental things I've seen. It could have been made by a 20-year-old or something like that. You know, the whole notion that because you get older you become less experimental is a nonsense. You know, he's living proof of that. People like Chris Marker were an influence. There were a lot of musical influences. There was also literal influences on it. I should say there's Karl Ove Knausgaard, which I should probably aren't saying correctly, the Norwegian novelist who pretty much took his whole life in the My Struggle series, and wrote about things that were happening in his own universe. That was quite an inspiration. The whole idea that you can turn your life into art in a sense. That was quite significant. But filmmakers, yeah, there've been so many people, you know, that have had a bearing on it, and bearing on what I've tried to do with it. There are a few references. There's one film in it called After Hitchcock, Before Doug Gordon, which says a lot about where I'm positioned, my age. But there's another film that's called The Ugly Duckling, Stan Brakhage version. So I mean, there's some examples. So it does give a nod. There's another film called The Zone after Tarkovsky.
Right.
So I mean, those are influences, as is Terrence Malick. You know, his use of disconnected voices. So the influences are very far and wide. You know, Scottish influences as well. You know, the Bill Douglas trilogy.
Yeah.
You know,
fantastic.
So that, you know, I don't know, to identify one influence is difficult. You know?
Yeah. And can you even think about what you're going to do next, or is this, you know, kind of all encompassing?
Well, if it's kind of, by the end of it, I felt pretty burnt out making all those films, and also, you know, having gone through and had my cancer treatment and finished it after 10 years, you know, and now actually showing what's gone on. But there are other projects. I mean, there's a few. One of the chapters, chapter 14, I think it is called Unfinished Business. And it's all very much about films that I've been working on that I don't think I'll get to finish, partly because of age, partly because circumstances have changed. I mean, I think it's very difficult now. I think the era of the parachute great white Western filmmaker going into conflict zones and filming what's happening and, you know, then coming back, I think it's done. I mean, I think that, you know, the best films coming out of Ukraine are being made by Ukrainian artists, filmmakers. The best films from the Middle East. Al Jazeera, what they're doing at the moment, it's phenomenal, you know, in the Gaza Strip, you know, the material that they're getting and the way they're working. So we can't replace them, you know, and I think there was a certain sort of imperial arrogance to it, you know, the great white filmmaker sort of parachutes in, saves the world kind of thing. There is that, and the other aspect of it is, you know, it seems very easy to fly in the international hack pack to a conflict zone, yet it's very complicated to actually get aid to people, and you do wonder why that is sometimes, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I mean, for me, and are there other films? I have a project that I'm developing at the moment called in Jamaica, of all places, but that's a very difficult project, but it's a very personal project. It's about a friend of mine who basically is, for want of a better term, he's a hill farmer, a yard, a traditional yardie, what they would call a yard. So but the landscape's falling apart, you know, because of global warming and also because of globalization, that the hill farmers are being, you know, out, you know, they're disappearing because of these big corporate sort of farms that are taking over great areas of the countryside. So it is very much a film about growing old, I suppose, but also about globalization and the climate. And yeah, it's back to the power of observation. I think whatever I do next is going to be me pointing a camera at somebody else, relying on the power of observation to tell the story.
Well, that sounds fascinating, Doug. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you about this. Just before we say cheerio, we should say again where people can find out where to see it and when to see it, all of those things. It's the GFT website. Is that the best?
It's the GFT website, and the project, the first screening is on the 8th of June. That runs through to the 12th, and then on the night of the 13th, we'll show the abridged feature cut with a Q&A between myself and I hope with Morag McKinnon, who's been following the project quite closely. So that's it. Go to the GFT program and do come along. One other point I should make is that because of the length of it, we've introduced a pay what you can, pay if you can policy, which is very much in keeping with the folk cinema ethos that I'm very fond of. So if you're skint, then you're welcome to come along. You know, you watch some films. You know, we're underwriting it anyway, sort of thing. But you know, hopefully we'll get enough people come in and feel that they can put a few quid down.
Excellent. And I will put the links to everything on the website so people can easily find where and when the films are shown. Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's
No problem.
I'm really excited to see the work in the cinema.
Okay, I'm looking forward to listening to what you're saying, and thanks for taking the time to speak to me.
Absolute pleasure. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.